The West Wing corridors buzzed with cautious energy. It was just past 9 a.m., and Karoline Leavitt was already on her second espresso and fourth policy briefing. She moved with purpose, heels clicking, silver cross at her collar shining under the fluorescence. She was used to pressure. At 27, she wasn't just the youngest White House press secretary in history. She was also the most outspoken. Her loyalty to Donald Trump was unwavering, her media takedowns sharp, and her unapologetic faith made headlines every time she stepped behind a podium. But that morning the tone shifted. Emma, her chief of staff, intercepted her outside the Roosevelt room. "Kevin McCarthy wants to see you." Alone. Karoline blinked. "Did he say why?" Emma hesitated. "Didn't have to." His aide looked tense. Karoline nodded and straightened her blazer. She knew McCarthy, former Speaker of the House, GOP kingmaker, and one of the architects of party strategy. He didn't call meetings without motive, and certainly not without agenda. She walked down the narrow hallway toward the office McCarthy occasionally used when meeting with the president. The walls were lined with framed executive orders and historical photos. It all felt oddly quiet. She knocked once. "Come in." McCarthy stood at the window, hands behind his back. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. No staff, no notes, just the two of them. "Karoline," he said smoothly, "you've made quite a name for yourself." She smiled tightly. "I'd like to think I've earned it." He nodded, then sighed. "Which is why we have a problem." She froze, the air thickening. The party's shifting. Media's watching every move. Donors are nervous. You're too loud, too raw, and honestly, too dangerous. Karoline narrowed her eyes. Dangerous how? McCarthy walked closer, lowering his voice. "The base loves you, but leadership doesn't. Trump might back you today, but politics change fast. So here's what I'm asking. Step down gracefully. Write the letter. Hand it in quietly. Say it's personal. You'll be back someday." Karoline stared at him, breath slow. He placed a blank envelope on the table. "You have until Friday." And with that, he left her alone in the room, with nothing but silence, a chair, and the sound of her heartbeat pounding like a war drum. Karoline sat in the silent office, the envelope on the table like a dare. The fluorescent light above flickered slightly, as if reacting to the tension in the room. Her fingers hovered above the manila paper, but she didn't reach for it. She wasn't afraid, just furious. Too raw? Too dangerous? McCarthy's words rang louder the more she thought about them. She had taken bullets from media outlets, activists, even late-night comedians. But now the warning came from inside her own ranks, from someone who should have had her back. "They want my resignation. Not because I failed, but because I shook things too much." Emma found her in the hallway moments later, her voice low. "What did he say?" Karoline didn't break stride. "He gave me a deadline." They reached her office, and she locked the door behind them. Emma leaned on the edge of the desk while Karoline paced. "Do they think I was doing this for applause?" Karoline asked. "I've defended this administration through fire. I've spoken when no one else would. And now that I've become a threat to their comfort zones, they want me to fade," Emma offered. "He's worried about donors," Karoline scoffed. "Donors don't elect presidents. People do." She sat down and stared at the blank resignation letter on her screen. Not a single word had been typed. She considered it, just long enough to understand what they really wanted. It wasn't about stepping down, it was about stepping aside. And Karoline Leavitt had never made a habit of doing that. Later that evening, a staffer from the communications team dropped off a draft statement from McCarthy's office. Polite, polished, press-ready. "Miss Leavitt has decided to step away to focus on personal growth." Karoline tore it in half without reading past the first sentence. Then she did something no one expected. She pulled out a fresh page, not to write a resignation letter, to write a speech. One that would turn the table they tried to corner her with into her platform. By sunrise, Karoline's office looked like a campaign bunker. Printed notes sprawled across the desk. Yellow highlighters marked phrases on old transcripts. Her laptop screen flickered with talking points. not for stepping down, but for standing up. She hadn't slept. Neither had Emma, who was now balancing a phone on one shoulder while typing furiously with both hands. "You're actually doing this?" Emma asked. Karoline didn't look up. "They want quiet. I'm giving them clarity." She knew what was at stake. If she went public, she wouldn't just be risking her job, she'd be declaring open defiance against one of the GOP's most powerful figures. There would be blowback, isolation, maybe even Trump's distance if he felt cornered. But Karoline never chose this job for comfort. She chose it because truth demanded a voice. By noon, word had already leaked. Is Karoline Leavitt resigning? Did Kevin McCarthy push her out? Is MAGA's voice of fire burning too hot for the party? Fox producers texted. CNN anchors speculated. Even the New York Times ran a teaser. Internal Republican shakeup? Press secretary's position in question. Emma leaned across the table. They're prepping both stories, one where you resign quietly and one where you go rogue. Karoline tapped her pen against the table, eyes calm. Then let's give them a third option. The truth: she scheduled a live press statement for Friday, McCarthy's deadline. No networks were told in advance, no leaks, no coordination, just a simple tweet from Karoline's official account. This Friday, 11 a.m. I have something to say. Within minutes, number Karoline Speaks Again began trending. Speculation exploded, and McCarthy's team started dialing. Emma's phone lit up again. She didn't answer. Karoline, still calm, stood before her office mirror. She adjusted the cross at her collar and whispered to herself, "They think I'll go down quiet, but they forgot who gave me my voice." This wasn't just damage control, it was the beginning of her reckoning. By Thursday night, Washington was no longer whispering. The press briefing room was booked under Karoline Leavitt's name. No agenda had been released, no official statement circulated. And yet, every major outlet had confirmed attendance. The silence around her speech only amplified the tension. She's not stepping down, she's staging something. That was the quote from an unnamed GOP aide printed in Politico, and it was exactly what Karoline wanted them to believe. She wasn't staging anything. She was telling the truth. Inside her apartment, Karoline stood barefoot in the kitchen, coffee in hand, laptop screen glowing with draft lines she'd written and rewritten. Emma was asleep on the couch, surrounded by empty water bottles and wrinkled notes. Karoline quietly whispered her opening line to herself. They didn't ask me to resign. They told me. The weight of that sentence wasn't just personal. It was political, cultural. A reminder that women who speak too boldly still get asked to sit down, even by their own, especially by their own. She clicked off her laptop and walked to the window. Below, the city pulsed with life. Cars blurring past, lights flickering, ambitions colliding. Somewhere out there, McCarthy was likely calling donors, prepping spin, maybe even preparing a public statement of his own, just in case. But Karoline wasn't prepping for damage. She was prepping for impact. The next morning, her team arrived early. No makeup artists, no PR strategists, just Emma, 2 aides, and the speech in a folder Karoline refused to share until the moment came. "If I fall," she told Emma, "I fall on my own words." Emma just smiled. "Then I hope they're wearing armor." At 10:58 a.m., Karoline stood at the podium. The room was electric. Reporters were already live. Social media counters ticked upward by the second. Even rival networks streamed the event. And in the front row, Kevin McCarthy's chief strategist sat with arms crossed, face unreadable. Karoline looked down once at the folder. Then she closed it. She didn't need paper to say what was carved into her spine. She looked into the cameras, adjusted her cross, and took a breath. Karoline's voice rang out sharp and steady. "Let me be clear. No one asked me if I was ready to step aside. They told me I had until Friday, this morning, to walk away quietly, to keep the peace, to make the donors comfortable." The press room froze. Phones hovered mid-air. Pens stopped moving. "I was told I'm too loud, too young, too loyal, and too willing to say what others only hint at behind closed doors. A ripple moved through the crowd, reporters shifting, whispers building, McCarthy's aide now leaning forward. They gave me a blank envelope and a polite draft. They said to say it was personal, that it was my decision, but it wasn't. Not even close. Emma stood just off stage, her arms folded, expression unreadable, but her eyes burned with pride. I wasn't hired to be agreeable. I was hired to tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it threatens old alliances, especially when it rattles those who think their tenure earns them immunity. Karoline paused, letting her words settle like thunder after lightning. So, I won't resign, I won't retreat, and I will not apologize for doing my job with conviction. Not for party pressure, not for political calculus, not for anyone. The room erupted, not in applause, but in something rarer in Washington: respect. Even those who disagreed with her politically couldn't deny the moment. This wasn't just a defiance of McCarthy, it was a message to every young staffer, silenced aide, and second-guessed woman in power. You do not have to leave to be heard. Karoline looked directly into the main camera. To the millions of Americans watching, especially young women, when they try to shrink you to fit their image, break the frame. When they hand you a resignation letter you didn't ask for, tear it up. Then, from her blazer pocket, she pulled a folded piece of paper. She opened it slowly, and in front of the entire room, she ripped it in half. The sound echoed louder than any applause ever could, and then she slammed her hand on the podium, not in anger, in finality. The sound of Karoline's palm hitting the podium echoed long after the final shred of paper drifted to the floor. Nobody moved. Not a cough, not a scribble, not a whisper. Even the seasoned reporters, trained to stay neutral, looked stunned. Some raised eyebrows. Others dropped their pens entirely. McCarthy's aide in the front row didn't even blink. His jaw was locked, his eyes flickering with what could only be described as panic. "Questions?" Karoline asked, voice cool, calm, almost amused. A dozen hands shot up. "Will you face repercussions from the party? Has Donald Trump responded to this? Are you worried about losing your position?" She answered none of them directly. "This isn't about me. It's about how many people get told to sit down because they're not polished enough, not safe enough. I've met Americans who speak more truth in a single diner booth than some leaders do in a 4-year term." She glanced toward the back of the room, where a young intern stood frozen near the door, clearly shaken, maybe even inspired. "And to the young staffers watching, they'll tell you this town runs on protocol, but it actually runs on pressure. If you can't stand under it, they'll try to make you disappear. But pressure doesn't break diamonds. It makes them." And with that, she stepped back from the podium. No thank you. No follow-up. Just silence. A new kind of silence. The kind that says everything just changed. Emma met her outside the briefing room. That was... Karoline exhaled. Necessary. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number popped up. "You've started something we can't control." And that's exactly what scares them. No name, no signature, just a final line. More to come. Be ready. Karoline pocketed the phone and kept walking. This wasn't the end of a speech. It was the start of a storm. The moment Karoline ripped up the resignation letter, the world didn't just watch, it ignited. Within an hour, every major news network had aired the footage. Conservative outlets hailed it as a defining stand against establishment politics. Liberal commentators, begrudgingly or not, admitted her act was a masterstroke of political theater. Social media detonated. A slow-motion clip of her slamming the podium with dramatic music underneath hit 1 million views in 30 minutes. The hashtags #Karoline won't fold, #rip the script, and #unbossed and unbought trended globally. This wasn't just a political move. This was a cultural moment, one headline declared. Inside Republican circles, the reaction was far more fractured. Some strategists saw gold, raw authenticity that could energize the party's disillusioned base. Others saw a ticking time bomb. The Republican National Committee issued no official statement. McCarthy's office stayed silent. Only an anonymous leak to the Hill carried their disapproval. Ms. Leavitt's behavior reflects a personal brand, not party unity. That line was meant to dismiss her. Instead, it gave her movement a name. Karoline didn't reply to reporters. She didn't post online. She didn't need to. The clip spoke for itself. But in private, she and Emma sat in her White House office, watching the storm unfold across 15 different screens. Emma scrolled through reaction videos. CNN's panel is torn. One anchor called you a fire starter in a flammable town. Karoline raised an eyebrow. They're not wrong. Her phone buzzed again. Another anonymous message. Just one line. You did what we never dared. You're not alone anymore. It wasn't the first. Over a dozen such messages had come in since Friday. Some from interns, others from congressional aides, one from a former campaign manager who had vanished after a scandal, but was clearly still watching. Each one echoed the same sentiment. You didn't just rip paper. You tore through silence. Back at the RNC, the mood had shifted from damage control to confusion. No one could figure out whether Karoline was now a liability or an uncontainable asset. Polls showed a spike in grassroots support. Small donors flooded her inbox. Fox commentators debated whether she should run for office herself. In the quiet of her office, Karoline stayed calm. They think this ends with a viral clip, she said. They're wrong. Emma leaned back in her chair. So what now? Karoline didn't hesitate. Now I keep talking, and I see who listens. See. By Monday morning, the air inside the West Wing felt thicker. Karoline had barely stepped into her office when Emma rushed in, her phone already held out like a live grenade. The screen displayed a meeting invite, plain, sterile, no subject line. From Chief of Staff location, Oval Office time, 11:30 a.m. Attendees, POTUS. Karoline read it once, then again. Emma didn't need to speak. They both knew what this meant. The silence from party leadership over the weekend hadn't been indifference. It had been strategy, waiting to corner her in person. Should I call legal? Emma asked. Karoline shook her head. Number, I'm going alone. At 11:28 a.m., she walked the marble halls toward the Oval with her chin high and her pulse steady. Staffers glanced up as she passed, most pretending not to stare. But they all knew. Everyone in Washington had seen the moment she tore the letter. And now everyone was waiting to see whether she would be torn down in return. The Oval Office was quiet when she entered. The president sat behind the resolute desk, flanked by two of his most senior advisors. Their faces were carefully arranged, expressions of cordial concern barely hiding the tension underneath. Karoline, the president said, gesturing to the seat opposite him. Take a moment. She sat, spine straight, fingers lightly folded in her lap. The president tapped a manila folder on the desk. You understand what you've triggered. Karoline didn't blink. Clarity. One of the advisors leaned in. What you did was reckless. You forced the Speaker of the House into a corner on live television. Karoline tilted her head. No one forced him to corner me first. The advisor's jaw tightened, but the president held up a hand. Let's be honest, Karoline. You've become a symbol. That gives you power, but it also makes you dangerous, to both sides. I'm not trying to be a symbol, she said calmly. I just won't play dead when someone hands me a loaded envelope. The other advisor broke in. You're trending higher than any press secretary in a decade. That kind of spotlight comes with consequences. If you're going to burn down the old order, we need to know what you plan to build. Karoline leaned forward slightly. Something honest. Something loud. Something that doesn't come with a pre-approved script. The president exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers on the desk again. You'll stay in your role. But the protection you had? That's gone. Karoline nodded once. Good. I never asked for a shield. He gave her a long look. Then, just a hint of something else in his expression. Respect. As Karoline left the Oval, aides turned to look. But this time, they weren't watching her fall. They were watching her rise. Karoline walked out of the Oval Office with no fanfare, no entourage, just the steady echo of her heels down the hallway and the distant buzz of a White House still recovering from the aftershock. She hadn't been fired, she hadn't been silenced, but she had been warned. The protection you had? That's gone. Yet Karoline knew something else. The walls didn't offer her safety anymore. The people did. By the time she reached her office, her inbox was flooded. Some were official, others encrypted. But the tone was the same across the board. She had cracked something open. I watched your press conference from my basement. I cried. I've worked in this town for 9 years and I've never seen someone speak like that. You've got enemies now, but you've got an army too. You made me believe we could still change things. Many of the messages weren't from big names. They were from interns, staffers, military spouses, exhausted voters, people who had spent years being polite, following rules, muting themselves in rooms dominated by those who spoke louder but meant less, and now Karoline had spoken for them. Emma entered the room holding a tablet. "The internet's melting again," she said. "Number sign Karoline effect is trending, and not just in political circles." She tossed the tablet onto the couch, then sat beside Karoline. "You're not just a press secretary anymore," she said. "You're something else." Karoline took a breath. She wasn't ready to call it a movement. That sounded too rehearsed, too self-important. She hadn't torn up that letter to launch a revolution. She'd done it to stay honest with herself. But the country had seen more than defiance. They saw permission to speak, to challenge, to push back against the machinery that silenced them. That night, she received a call from a conservative think tank. They wanted her to headline an upcoming conference on the next generation of Republican leadership. She didn't commit, but she didn't hang up either. Later, she drove alone to a quiet spot in Arlington, an overlook where the DC skyline burned against the dark. She rolled down the windows and listened to the wind. She thought about her parents in New Hampshire, the sacrifices they made, the faith they instilled. She thought about the first time she'd walked into the White House as a junior staffer, overdressed, overprepared, and underestimated. And she thought about how far she had come from that girl. Now, people were watching her, some with admiration, some with fear, and that meant she was doing something right. The next weekend, Karoline Leavitt took the stage at the Conservative Rising Voices Summit in Tampa. Not as a press secretary, not even as a proxy for the White House, but as herself. She hadn't been invited through official channels. In fact, when the organizers first drew up the schedule, her name was absent. But after the explosion of support online, after the endless clips of her tearing the resignation letter and calling out her own party's complacency, the pressure had been impossible to ignore. A petition demanding she be added to the speaker list hit 100,000 signatures in under 36 hours. Now, under bright lights and in front of a packed crowd, she stepped to the microphone with no script in hand. Her silver cross shimmered against her dark navy blazer, an emblem now burned into the collective memory of the moment she refused to back down. She took one breath, and then she spoke. "I didn't come here to tell you what I think you want to hear. I came here because someone told me to disappear, and I said no." Thunderous applause. They said I was too outspoken, too young, too unwilling to play the long game. But I'm not here to wait my turn while the country bleeds out. The audience was dead silent, not out of disinterest, but reverence. Some people in Washington think leadership is about who you know. I think it's about who you protect, and right now too many Americans feel unprotected, by both sides. Karoline paused, then looked directly into the cameras. "So let me be perfectly clear. I'm not here to burn the Republican Party to the ground. I'm here to make sure it finally remembers who it was supposed to serve." Cheers erupted. In that moment, she didn't sound like someone managing press logistics for another politician. She sounded like a politician in her own right. After the speech, interviews flooded in. Donors whispered. Staffers shifted uneasily in their chairs. Kevin McCarthy's name was trending again, but not for anything he did. It was because of her. "Karoline's not just a voice," one headline read. She's a warning shot. As she exited the stage, a young woman from a small college Republican group approached her. "How did you know you were ready to speak like that?" she asked. Karoline smiled softly. "I wasn't. I was just tired of waiting for someone else to do it." That night, back at her hotel, she sat alone on the balcony overlooking the ocean. Her phone buzzed nonstop. News alerts, texts, praise, pushback. But one message stood out. From an unlisted number. "They underestimated you. We won't make that mistake again." She put the phone down, not in fear, but with clarity. She hadn't just survived the machine, she'd made it blink. And now, wherever the road led, whether it was a future campaign, a reshaped party, or just one more mic dropped in the name of truth, she knew this much. They could ask her to step down, but they'd never stop her from standing up. Karoline Leavitt didn't just tear a resignation letter. She tore open the curtain that hides the quiet politics of intimidation, where voices like hers are managed, not embraced. She stood in a city where power often values silence over sincerity, and she chose neither. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't seek applause. She didn't wait her turn. She spoke, and that was enough to terrify the ones who thought they held the script. What began as a backroom ultimatum became a national awakening. A single woman, young, fierce, unapologetically principled, stood before cameras, ripped the silence to pieces, and reminded America that leadership isn't granted by title, but proven by fire. This was more than rebellion. It was revelation. That truth still matters. That courage still counts. And that no one, not even the most powerful men in the room, gets to decide who's allowed to speak. Because Karoline Leavitt didn't just survive their pressure. She rewrote what survival looks like.